Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion this morning, which looks at innovations in climate governance and financial solutions to deliver just transition. We might be joined by one more speaker in the course of the day, but she's currently tied up with negotiations. As everyone knows, inequality and justice is inherent to the issue of climate change. I think we know that the reasons the climate change is happening, there is inequality in contributions that different countries have made to the challenge of climate change historically over time. There is also great inequality in the ability of countries to respond to climate challenge, both to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to reduce emissions. And also many countries, or most of the countries which are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, are not the ones historically who are responsible for the bulk of emissions that have caused the challenge. But recently, we're also very aware of inequality considerations that we should take into account as we are crafting our response to climate change, because different communities will be affected differently by the solutions that we design to address climate crisis. And it's very important that those solutions that are put forward take into account those considerations and are designed in such a way that we can not only avoid making current inequalities worse, but can actually design solutions in a way that we can help improve the current inequalities in our societies. And this is what our discussion is today. My name is Alina Averchenkova. I'm from the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics, and I'm joined by a distinguished panel today who I will introduce very shortly. So on my right is Lara Lazaro-Tuza, who is a senior analyst at Real Elcano Institute in Spain. Next to Lara is Tiffany Chan, who is associate at Just Transition Finance Lab and policy analyst at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Next to Tiffany is Britta Renkamp, who is a senior researcher at the University of Cape Town. And last but not least, to my left is Simon Ben Maratze, who is a team lead for technology and infrastructure at International Renewable Energy Agency, Alina. We hope to still be joined by the lead negotiator on just transition from Colombia, Maria Cristina Cifuentes, negotiations permitting from Colombia. So before I hand to our panelists, I wanted to set the stage for our discussion today. So I think, as I've outlined, inequality is central to climate challenge, but when we think about inequalities, there are different types that we should be aware of. And it's important when we're thinking about governance of climate change that those different types of inequalities are taken into consideration in the design of the solution. So there are recognitional inequalities, who is in and who is left out when the policy process and policy agenda is being designed. There are procedural inequalities, who gets a say in the design of the policy solution. And again, oftentimes the most vulnerable communities, they have difficulty to have access to policymaking processes. And then, of course, there are distributional inequalities, who benefits from the NDCs, for example, who benefits from the implementation of renewable energy, and perhaps who gets to suffer when we close coal mines and shift to other energy technologies. These are just some type of inequalities that we should consider. And of course, in the negotiations now, there is a large focus on just transition. The concept originally emerged from the labor movement in the 1980s and was initially about dealing with workers negatively affected by the transition. But I think now it's a much broader approach to just transition that we're looking at. Actually, we understand just transition as effort to ensure that when we plan and invest in a transition, we ensure environmentally and socially sustainable jobs, sectors, and economies are put in place that bring the whole society on the transition and leave no one behind. So today we're talking specifically about innovation and climate governance. And in addition to Paris Agreement recognizing just transition, and there is now being an agenda on how we address just transition internationally, we're seeing a lot of developments around the world in how countries are integrating justice consideration in their national response to climate change. Many countries are creating new institutions that are set to ensure that the transition to low carbon economy and adaptation are just. For example, just transition commissions in Scotland, in Ireland, in Spain. So Lara is going to talk about Spain's experience in doing so. There are also institutions and programs being set up to finance just transition. And Simon will talk about global energy landscape and what we're seeing in terms of international energy transition and how new financing initiatives are emerging to address this equity challenge and what are the gaps, what still needs to be done. What we are also seeing is that many countries are integrating just transition into their climate laws, and Tiffany will share the results of the initial analysis of how countries are addressing just transition in their climate legislation. But in a separate piece of research recently that we conducted looking at the impact of climate legislation, we actually have evidence that integrating just transition considerations in climate laws do lead to countries being more effective in implementing just transition policies. And finally, Britta will share how just transition can also spur social innovation. So she will share experiences on that from Africa and Brazil. So without further ado, we are going to now have each panelist talk for about 7 minutes, and then we will go to the discussion with yourselves. So please think about your questions and your comments. So first of our speakers, Tiffany, you have the floor. What are we seeing globally in terms of how countries are integrating just transition considerations?
Thanks, Alina. So today I'm presenting and discussing some of the key findings from a new report that we are publishing next week. So the Grantham Research Institute and the Just Transition Finance Lab. And what we're looking at is where justice considerations are actually being implemented through national level climate change policies and laws. But before I jump into that, I just wanted to set out why we were motivated to do this piece of research and linking it a bit to what's been happening in Bonn the past few days. So as Alina mentioned, we do really owe it to the trade union movement that the just transition concept has risen to outside here, the climate negotiations. But I think it has been very much acknowledged both at the international level and national level now that it's much more beyond just the just transition of the workforce. There are other communities that will be affected by the low carbon transition. And it's clear that the pathways to reaching the Paris Agreement goals will affect everyone: workers, consumers, Indigenous communities, women, youth, children, and elderly. The list goes on. And now I'm going to touch a little bit about what we found across countries in terms of that as well, the affected groups. And the opportunities and the challenges, as well as the barriers to achieving sustainable development and poverty eradication, both of which are referenced in the UAE Just Transition Work Programme decision last year. They will raise different questions of justice and different types of groups, and therefore different ways about addressing those and how they will be implemented through policy and applied and enforced. And that diversity, as well as the fact that countries themselves will have different definitions of what a just transition really means, and that's shaped by the specific context. So that could be the development pathways, it could be the historic contributions to the climate crisis of that country, it could be the specific vulnerabilities. There are many different factors that will play into what a just transition would look like for each country, and even within the country between sectors. And so this diverse perspective, as well as the broadened acknowledged scope in the policy discourse, is what we wanted to look at how is that actually translating in terms of national level executive policies and legislation. So that was our main motivation to try and understand it, to broaden this idea of just transition and look at where justice is being addressed across different areas. So what we did was at Grantham Research Institute, we maintain an online database of climate change laws and policies around the world. It's called Climate Change Laws of the World, not very innovative as a name, despite the name of our event. So what we did was we did a search. The database is powered by a semantic search. Don't ask me too much about the natural languaging processes of that, but essentially we searched for both policies that expressly use just transition or fair transition, inclusive, equitable, the synonyms of that, as well as specifically the different types of justice. So we looked at distributive, procedural, restorative, transitional. I can give you the full list later, but different types of justice and see what came up. So that resulted in about 159 policies or laws across 61 countries and the European Union. And what we did was we reviewed those across different dimensions to try and understand, essentially, when governments talk about just transition and justice, what do they really mean and what are they trying to implement to address the impacts, but also create the benefits associated with climate change policies. And finance is a really crucial piece of this because it obviously enables, it's a key enabler to actually implementing those policies. And policy frameworks can shape and signal where the finance needs to flow, but also it can set standards and regulations around transparency and accountability for where those funds are actually going and whether they're reaching the communities that the policy envisions it to reach. And from the finance actors' side as well, the perceptions, or at least the lack of the planning around a just and orderly transition in itself is a financial risk because it will pose barriers in terms of potential backlash, social backlash, resistance, and delays. And this is why in the report we try to both speak about what policymakers should be looking at as well as what finance actors should be looking at. So I'll move now quickly to highlight just a few of the key findings from the report, and happy to go into more of that in the discussion. So the first dimension we looked at is the type of justice. Which type of justice are these policies overall trying to look at? And perhaps expectedly, the most common across the policies is distributive justice. So essentially looking at trying to address where the burdens of the transition of climate change policy lie. So roughly that appeared in 128 of the assessed documents, and that covered 59 countries. But the second most common related to procedural justice, so essentially the agency of those being affected. But this only tallied about half of what I've just mentioned, so about 63 policies. And this is what we find as a little bit of a gap in terms of this inclusive participatory process is so central to the idea of delivering justice and having a just transition that this is also heightened especially now when we're in a climate of disinformation and proliferation of this, where social backlash and public backlash to climate change policies being introduced can really be heightened. The need to actually speak and consult and include them in the decision-making processes around climate change policies is something that we don't quite see as much as the distributive concerns as of yet. But the second dimension we looked at, which is very much tied to that, is then who they're trying to address, so which affected group. And in this, the most common are workers, which remains a top priority, but also communities and consumers and households. And within communities, sometimes we have policies that are very specific about what types of communities those are. So rural communities, for example, or it could be communities of color. So that would relate to the more environmental justice and race implications of that. So there were different, that's where we also see divergence across countries and regions, as you would expect, given that it relates to the social economic profiles as well of those countries. The third dimension we looked at is the range of policy instruments or policy levers, tools that we would try and implement to then address what they've identified. And here we see four main buckets. The first being finance, and predominantly public finance. So this could be consumer rebates, this could be tax reform, it could be employment insurance, various types of mechanisms. The second being institutional arrangements and strategy articulation, and this is what is the governance side of it. So this could be within climate acts or climate framework laws, there might be provisions setting up coordination bodies within government, interministerial, but also platforms to engage with other stakeholders like civil society and business. Then the third category being skills development and labor market policies. This is very much in line with the ILO 2015 guidelines for the just transition. So the policy areas identified in that around helping workers transition, but also for the future, education and training for the youth to gear towards the green jobs sector. Yeah. And then finally, the last being participation and stakeholder engagement, as well as social dialogues to specific workers' engagement mechanisms. But that one was slightly less, which was once again in line with what I just mentioned on procedural justice. The final thing we looked at in terms of a dimension is just the concept of change that policy envisions. So there can be, what this means is there can be policies that are much more targeted at market-driven changes, which we refer to and other scholars refer to as managerial reform or status quo approaches. And these might not necessarily address the root causes of the existing inequalities that Alina referenced earlier. And then the other category being structural reforms or more transformative changes that really challenge, for example, social ownership that challenges the existing power relations. And that, as you might expect, we see much less of compared to the managerial reform approaches. And I think to round off what this really means in terms of, if I could pick one of the top recommendations, we make several in the report, but the top being that clearly there is going to be a complex interaction between different policies and different policy instruments and different groups in order to actually have a just transition. And I think that really emphasizes the value of having documents like the NDCs, especially now that they're coming up very soon in terms of a reiteration, NDC 3.0. These are ways that at least countries can be very, very clear about how they planned to synthesize the different actions that they're planning and how these will work with actually existing social protection systems, because just transition relates to a lot of existing inequalities and social determinants that really there needs to be a planning process around how these new climate change policies and these new just transition or compensation mechanisms are meant to work together with these existing ones, and the clear signposting of the comprehensive policy frameworks that are available at the national level can really help also finance actors then translate that into where their funds need to go and how they should be delivered in a just and equitable way. And one of the tools that I heard about yesterday here was the NDC Partnerships NDC 3.0 Navigator, which now has a part about just transition to help countries try and incorporate it better into NDCs. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Very interesting findings. And I suppose you're finding that we're still not doing enough on the procedural justice and involving those who are affected in the decision-making process. I think we're seeing we're seeing outcomes of failing to do that with the recent EU elections, for example, with Green Party losing support in a massive way and generally population moving to the right. I think the trust in climate policy and the transition that we're trying to implement is a very important component. So should be a wake-up call for us to really step up and address procedural justice going forward. But very, very good recommendations there. So a lot of food for thought for the discussion. So with that, I'm now going to go to Simon. So we're going to have more of a global outlook on the practice in terms of ensuring just transition on an energy side. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alina. A very good morning to everyone. Tiffany, you mentioned NDC 3.0, the next iteration of NDC. I think that's a timely discussion we're having today on the integration of new concepts on governance and financial aspects, especially for the very important parties, which are LDCs that sits in the Paris Agreement. On the progress and challenges in the global transition, 2023 was marked by a duality of growth in renewable energy capacity, but also persistent disparity in its distribution. Alina statistics reveal a remarkable milestone where a record-breaking of around 473 gigawatts of new renewable power were installed globally, and this was driven primarily by a surge in declining cost and also an increase in efficiency, a notable increase for variable renewables like solar and wind energy. And this signals a transformational shift toward more adoption of sustainable energy solutions. In the investment side, also we reached an unprecedented height, exceeding last year $2 trillion. And this underscores a growing recognition among stakeholders, which include governments, businesses, and investors, on the urgency to decarbonize economies, and especially more and more emphasis on the so-called hard-to-abate sector, which are also very capital-intensive and also prevalent in many developing countries. However, this narrative of progress marks a stark reality. The energy transition is still not unfolding equitably. A vast chasm separates developing and developed countries, creating a landscape where the benefits of renewables are not yet universally shared. And this disparity, in our opinion and analysis, is not merely a matter of social justice. It is a critical challenge that undermines the progress toward achieving the 1.5C. Consider the following data points. Europe per capita renewable energy capacity is today nearly 30 times higher than of Africa. And this gap is not narrowing, it is widening. In 2023, while Europe installed more or less 100 gigawatts of new renewable capacity, Africa stands at 4 gigawatts. So this also translates in the investment imbalance. The per capita investments of technology on the energy transition in North Africa dwarf sub-Saharan Africa by a factor of 57. It means that every dollar invested in renewable energy in the most affluent region, only a fraction reached the community that we believe needed the most. In North America, investments total around $600 billion, and while Sub-Saharan Africa only received around $10 billion. Despite the growth, also, we see a still widening gap in energy access, where around 770 million people lack access to power, and 2.4 billion still rely on polluting fuel for cooking. The vast majority of this energy poor population resides today in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The disparity are not merely statistics, they are a moral and practical failure to ensure a just and equitable transition. And they have also a profound implication on the negotiation today we are witnessing here. Also, importantly, those countries are facing the brunt of climate change. They are experiencing more frequent and intense drought, flood, heat waves, and other extreme weather events, and they lack the financial and technology resources to decarbonize their economies at scale. Also, I wanted to highlight work that Alina is supporting, especially, hello, no problem, scaling of finance. So the flow of financial resources toward the developing countries needs to be dramatically increased and targeted toward the countries that need the most, especially LDCs. This not only include public financing, but also innovating financial mechanism that can leverage the private sector and private capital. And Alina shows that today, LDCs today are not receiving adequate financing flows. Just transition policy framework needs to be designed with the focus on equity and social justice. These include measures to protect a vulnerable community, creating jobs, decent jobs in the sector, and also ensuring a more fair distribution of the benefits across the population. And also, Alina work helps to integrate socioeconomic elements, which include expanding energy access and clean cooking solution, promoting gender equality, and also empowering youth and protecting the right of indigenous people. One question as well was the importance of the holistic policy frameworks and the arrangement at the institutions. I think what is important is that today we do not count only on technological investments. We need to create the enabling environment where renewable energy benefit can be distributed and also economic benefit can be further strengthened. Energy policies also in our analysis highlight that there is a risk of isolation, so they need to integrate broader development strategies, which is a key factor to unlock consensus in developing countries. And also they should not exacerbate existing inequalities, rather contributing to poverty reduction and improving livelihood for all. A key aspect in our analysis and discussion with our 168 member countries is the aspect of empowering local communities and stakeholders. It requires active participation for those most affected by the renewable energy shift, and also understanding the needs and concern and perspective when deciding new climate action plan. Third, Alina, the priority for enhanced international cooperation. Alina analysis show that the key priority for enhanced international cooperation is the strengthening of the multilateral frameworks. The Paris Agreement is merely a starting point. We need to build a foundation to achieve more ambitious targets for renewable deployment, mobilizing greater financial resources to make those plans credible enough so that the financial community can really use them as true investment plan. Developing countries also, through our work, show that they have a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with others. So here as well, the role of South-South cooperation will play a pivotal role in accelerating the transition. Each country can learn from each other's successes and often can leapfrog technological barriers and accelerate the integration of new and innovative solutions. South-South cooperation can come from various platforms and also result in increased knowledge exchange, capacity building, and also technical assistance from one to another. Financial cooperation, lastly, is also a crucial dimension for international collaboration. Developing countries need to access affordable and adequate finance to invest its infrastructure, technology, and capacity building of local stakeholders. And this will come from institutional financing resources that can mobilize and channel those resources toward projects that are signaled by governments in the developing world. We see also, lastly, a role on policy coordination. The transition is a complex process, essentially for trade, investment, and economic development, and we need to align countries on the regulations toward allowing more renewables and also moving from the traditional centralized energy system to the new decentralized and flexible modern energy systems. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you for highlighting the gaps that we still currently see in the energy transition, and also for giving some recommendations on what should happen if we are to raise a scale-up finance for just transition, which I think is very useful, and particularly in the context of ongoing discussions on the global financial goal. So let me go now to Britta, and so far we've talked quite a bit about the gaps and how to avoid negative impacts and ensure inequality. But in your work, you've also looked at the positives that just transition could bring, specifically on the impact on social innovation. So very, very curious to hear about your findings. So over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Alina. So I tried to focus on the positives in a rather depressing world outlook. But I'd like to share some findings on work that I've done around innovation, eco-innovation, and technological change more broadly in energy transitions in South Africa specifically. But I'm also working in a team where we have a center that has strong partnerships with other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. We're part of the African Research University Alliance, so trying to connect researchers within Africa doing research on issues that matter to Africa. And I would like just to share some of those insights that bring a bit of a Southern perspective into this, and where there are positives, but where there's also challenges in the implementation, because we all are in this together in a global South-North partnership, and we can't manage any of this alone. So firstly, just be mindful, because we said we'll talk about finance as well. The investment gap is rising. I don't know if you've seen the investment report, but the SDGs are basically further moving further out of reach as we progress, and we only have those 6 years left. At the same time, we also experiencing this nationalist push, which we've observed in the elections last week of the European Parliament. We've also witnessed some of it in the South African elections recently, where we're moving into first-time national coalition government. The 2024 is the year of many elections in Africa, and we've seen the polarization unfolding, as we've seen in many other countries as well. Also, let's be mindful, with the investment gap increasing, it also means that a lot of the capital is actually in the US and in China a lot more. So not available really in many of the global South countries, and also especially Sub-Saharan Africa. So there's that gap that's there. That's also Simon alluded to, especially for the installation of clean technology. But then there's also positives in terms of the movements that the US and the Chinese governments actually, in their, quite nationalist approaches, as we might also acknowledge, the US government with their unprecedented Inflation Reduction Act has mobilized finance in unprecedented ways, and has actually unlocked capital and investments and all of the benefits for eco-innovation in US companies, but also attracted a lot of foreign companies to move into the US and produce there. China, on the other hand, has obviously been unprecedented in producing solar photovoltaic panels for the benefit of all of us, that we can have accessible at more reasonable cost, where many also countries in Africa benefit from. And also the changes in battery technology that's been happening in China is also, with the decline in cost, is also a possible game changer for a lot of the other countries in the global South moving towards their clean energy transitions. So all of these are challenges, but there's also good news, and there's a lot of opportunities. So we must acknowledge these, but then there are transformative factors in this landscape. But how does it actually translate into innovation in South Africa, Southern Africa? And we're not talking innovation in terms of tech, right? So we're also talking innovation in terms of technology being a social outcome, an artifact, a recording of history and time, and a product of basically social society and social engagements. So South Africa itself it's quite a unique country in Africa, as it has to decarbonize. It basically produces it's about half of the emissions of the whole continent. So it's under the pressure to decarbonize, but it's also very much battled by the impacts of climate change at the same time. Then, due to the history, very much geared to mining, very exploitative practices that led to a very divided government and legacy that still oppresses the majority of people, where about 70% of South Africans are at financial risk and falling under the various poverty lines. So we still have a high income inequality, but we also have high multidimensional inequalities. And we see with all the climate impacts, those who are already vulnerable suffer the most. So now in this social outlook for South Africa, we've seen quite a lot of innovation in terms of renewables and progress moving forward, but we've also seen the damage of nationalistic and polarizing government state capture and corruption, and what it does to the progress of renewable specifically. So what we now call the lost decade has specifically undermined a quite successful program in rolling out grid-tied utility scale renewable energy programs. So a lot of this has been tried to rescue and to be moved back, and it's intersecting with a large-scale crisis of renewable energy implementation, but it's also led to quite a lot of innovation in the way that it's been a massive crisis response, mainly private, but also quite unequal in the way that it's those who could afford could make a plan, but finally were allowed to make a plan as regulations were lifted. And now we find actually that over the past year, we found the highest ever installation. So your numbers, Simon, you know, we might have to like push them up a little bit for what we've seen in South Africa for especially solar rooftop, just because people were left in the dark and needed to make a plan. What's also standing out for South Africa, given that it's the most unequal country in the world, we're in the middle of this transition, and there's been a quite innovative partnership called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, where Northern partners and South African actors have come together to put together a facility in finance that hasn't, for climate finance, that hasn't been seen as such before. It's been subject to a lot of attention. We're still wondering what the actual outputs are, what the risks of it are when it actually comes. But at least it has created new platforms for new conversations, also created investment plans that are in, you know, especially supporting the implementation of the NDC that result in a lot of policies that are left to be not implemented because of the opposition and in the economy, in the political economy. But we have a lot of the ingredients that are actually there to make transformative change and progress in our transition. Having said that, there are still a lot of people in the country and on the continent left behind without access, especially the cooking fuel. Poverty is often overlooked. It's a massive issue when we talk energy crisis in Africa. And just to conclude, so just reflecting back on the political push that we've seen towards nationalization, towards more conservative and even right-wing government, what we've seen, and just to also reflect what Alina just mentioned, we don't see the benefits of this massive technological change reach everyone. And because the perceptions then lead to these injustices that lead the voters to make those decisions to vote for their country first, for nationalistic parties first. That's where we really need to think, how can those be empowered, and how can the benefits of just energy transitions be distributed and accessible more broadly, so that you basically decentralize those benefits to mitigate the frustration that seems to still be persistent in many voters, and to make climate policy a normal, a legitimate policy that becomes also for other governments a priority, and not just the drawback into more fossil fuels. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Britta. Very interesting experiences and very sobering in some ways. So thank you so much for sharing and bringing those points to the table. So now we are going to go to another two country examples. So first we're going to look at Spain. And Lara, you've done some work looking at how demand for this climate transition to be just, demand from just transition from citizens, and the policy considerations for transition to net zero. How can we bring that together in the case of Spain? So over to you. Lara is going to use some slides. Could we please project those? Thank you.
So thank you. Great. Thank you ever so much, Alina. So today I'll be presenting work that we've undertaken at Elcano Royal Institute alongside many of my colleagues. So the structure of these very short 7 minutes is context survey and updating Spain's just transition strategy. So in Spain, we have a well-developed just transition governance structure. In 2018, a just transition strategy was proposed. This was adopted in 2020. We are to update this just transition strategy this year. And this motivated us to ask a question within a survey that we conducted at the end of 2023 on the extent to which citizens in Spain support this just transition strategy. So hence Alina's comment on the demand side of just transition. So just diving very quickly into some of the questions that were relevant to understanding Spanish citizens' position regarding climate change. We used the theoretical framework of the theory of recent action and planned behavior. So we asked questions about citizens' knowledge about climate change, attitudes towards climate change, intentions and actions regarding climate change. So the questions that I'm going to very briefly summarize come from that theoretical framework. So as regards perceptions on climate action and intentions, we see that climate policies have a negative impact on the economy, according to almost half of the Spanish population. The survey was conducted with 1,000 individuals, so that gives us a margin of error of plus minus 3.2%. So with this idea in mind, climate policies have a negative impact on the economy, and the idea that almost a quarter of Spanish citizens that we interviewed stated that climate measures reduce their freedom, and knowing that we have an employment rate that is normally, historically has been much higher than the European average, and we have very stringent climate goals. In the upcoming National Energy and Climate Plan, we are aiming for an 81% renewable power matrix by 2030. So with all of this, we asked about support for different types of policies. So what we see, and this was asked with a 5-point Likert scale, asking respondents to agree, very much in agreement, agree, neither agree or disagree, disagree or very much in disagreement, with supporting different types of policies and technologies. What we see in Spain is that by and large, we agree to the fact that the electricity we use should be produced with renewable energy sources, even if some people are unhappy about big infrastructures. So that is something we want to do. The other statement that is most relevant to our talk today is the government should invest in areas that lose businesses due to climate change or due to the policies enacted to address climate change. So this refers to the concepts of both restorative and distributive justice that Tiffany was alluding to before. So even though this is not the most popular policy, it is ranked quite high. And the most interesting response, the most interesting feature of this response is that if we analyze on the ideological spectrum, the extent to which just transition initiatives are supported, it is of all of the policies that we put forward. So Spain should have an independent scientific committee, part of the general state budget every year should be used to fight climate change, etc. The statement, the government should invest in areas that lose businesses due to climate change or due to the policies enacted to address it, is the one that garners the least divergence across the political spectrum. So it has wide support across the aisle, which is good news, because as we know, polarization happens in many other areas. For example, in the support for renewables, there's a 20% point difference between the far right and the far left in Spain. So support for just transition is the one that has the least divergence. We also asked ourselves which were the variables that had a bigger bearing on this support for just transition. And we run a model estimated using logistic regression. So support for just transition, yes or no. So that's our dependent variable. It's a dummy variable. And what we find is that ideology, municipal size, income are statistically significant predictors at a 5% significance level of support for a just transition. So being on the far left of the ideological spectrum increases the probability of supporting a just transition compared to the far right. As does having a low income. So if you earn 1,081 euros gross monthly, and we selected this bizarre figure because that was the minimum wage at the time where we designed the survey, has a positive impact in supporting just transition. Also, belonging to bigger municipalities, so between 50,000 and 100,000 inhabitants, decreases the likelihood of support for a just transition compared to smaller municipalities. And the rest of the variables are not statistically significant. We included, because we wanted to test whether there was distance decay effect, whether areas that had what we call a just transition agreement, which is a specific program of engaging with communities to design projects for when fossil fuels are phased out, specifically coal mining and coal power plants. We have a governance process in which the government, regional and local government, national, regional, and local governments, and people affected in the communities by this phase out, design and co-create initiatives in order to cope with the phase out of fossil fuels. So we said, well, in the areas in Spain where we have these just transition agreements, which are modeled on the French just transition contract, just ecological transition contracts, are they going to support this just transition initiatives more? And the answer is no. So this is a very broad support that we have from society. 1 minute, okay. So just very quickly, we can go into the average marginal effects if you're interested, and we have all of the stats there. And just to sum up, and as we are updating Spain's just transition strategy, as I said, this is going to happen in 2024. So this year, there's a clear cross-partisan support for just transition in Spain, even analyzing support from both sides of the aisle, both extreme sides of the aisle. While the current just transition is mostly focused on the phase out of fossil fuels, the future just transition strategy could incorporate a broader set of sectors, because clearly with the goals that we have for renewable expansion and with emerging geographies of discontent, as Andres Rodriguez Posé from the LSE puts it, we believe it's important to also translate these just transition agreements and just transition strategy to the deployment of renewables. Our proposal in this sense is to have social environmental contracts that mirror this just transition contracts that we've had in Spain. And I'll leave it at that. Happy to comment later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. Very, very interesting findings. And I think your point on people both from citizens from the right, political right and political left, all agreeing on a statement that Spain should fund policies to support those negatively affected in the transition. I think that's a very important one. And this is also consistent with our own findings. We have looked at what drives countries to take ambitious commitments on climate change and to adopt net zero targets. And one of the factors which came up very strongly was actually countries having a just transition narrative and integrating that into their explanation for why the country should take net zero and how it will implement it was a very important factor politically in countries being able to take net zero targets and to integrate them into their national climate laws. So very consistent. Thank you so much for sharing that. So our last speaker is Maria Cristina Cifuentes. Cristina, we're very grateful that you were able to step out from the negotiations. So Cristina is the leader of Just Transition negotiations for Colombia, and she works in the Ministry of Colombia, Ministry of Environment of Colombia as a peace professional in the NDC team, supporting the development of participation strategy. So I know you're going to talk about the methodological approach that you're taking in Colombia to including Just Transition into the NDC and the National Portfolio of Climate Action. But I'm also very curious if you could also touch on that, on participation aspect, because I think before you joined us, we talked about the fact that according to review of national climate laws and policies, not many countries yet are focusing on procedural justice, on actually giving those most effective a seat on the table, at the table. So very interested also to hear what you're doing in that respect in terms of participation in Colombia. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, so first.
Apologies, we have the slides as well. Could we please project them? Thank you so much.
So before we start with the methodological approach, in order to give you a general context about what we are dealing with in the negotiations right now, there is somehow a big concern that we don't have enough time to go into detail into the draft text. So as you know, we are mainly discussing a draft decision for the Just Transition Work Program. That's the main purpose. And the idea is for the COP, we want to adopt the draft decision. So it will be great to advance as much as possible in order to adopt the draft decision by then. And I think that the key role or main objective of having a draft decision this year is to have a set of guidelines, general guidelines, to orientate countries about how to include the Just Transition approach into their initiatives, programs, policies at national level. So then we can ensure that this is going to be implemented at local level, right? That's the main purpose in my understanding of working so hard in a convention, is to guide countries on this review. So for now, we have discussed the draft conclusions. So we plan today to close that conversation on draft conclusions, because there are still some small issues to agree with, and we have an operative part. We commented on that operative part last week in order, as you said, to enhance participation. That's one of the proposals that was made by Colombia and supported also by Canada, about the importance of adding the participatory approach, because they were talking only about inclusive approach. But if we follow the element F of the decision 3, CMA 5, we agreed in the last COP 7 elements, and one of the elements was about inclusive and participatory approaches. So we can't skip that part. It's already adopted, so now it's in the second version, which is great. So the second draft has included that word, but that word means a lot, because that's the way we are going to ensure that we can left no one behind and make it in a just climate justice perspective as well. So that's the general view from the negotiations. We are going to see what's going to happen in the session that it's in an hour with the contact group. I'm so sorry for coming late, but I was in G77 coordination. So we're still dealing and having an agreement on this, but we're going to try to advance as much as possible in order to get a decision by the COP. So now, let's start with the country. Well, a member of the NDC team in Colombia, and we are also working in the participation strategy this year for updating our NDC and submit it by February. So this is how our current NDC looks like, the one that was submitted by 2020. So it's we have 237 targets and measures with carbon neutrality, climate resilience, low carbon development, that as main object. We have 124 at national level, 89 at territorial level, and for private sector, 24. And this is the NDC that we are going to update by February of next year. And for that purpose, we have developed a participation strategy that we're going to start implementing in July of this year. So we plan to go to different territories of the country. The Ministry of Environment has identified some strategic regions, environmental regions to go. So then we are going to invite all the stakeholders of the region to participate there. And we will develop the work cafe methodology with a results-based approach and theory of change approach as well, to invite the stakeholders in each roundtable, not to think only about the ambition, but also to think about the transformative approach. So that's the main goal, that every time we try to set a new target or measure for an NDC, we can think how this target is going to create a transformation in that territory. And for that, we need local perspective. That's why inviting all the stakeholders or key stakeholders in each region is going to be absolutely key for us. So in that regard, in the participation strategy, we want to develop these tables that you see here. So in total 7, adaptation, mitigation, means of implementation, financing, another one for cross-cutting issues like climate justice, just transition, peace, differential approaches, biodiversity, and loss and damages. But we will orientate each facilitator is going to orientate the discussion in each table in order to get results about how we can enhance just transition in each one of the issues that you see here. And for that, we have developed a methodology for framing just transition in the climate portfolio of Colombia. So in that way, we can ensure financial resources for implementing the targets and measures. So we have a national portfolio that was launched in the COP28 in Dubai by the President of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. And he explained that we're going to have this portfolio, inviting all the sectors of the country to send their initiatives and projects that are going to help us to fulfill the ambition, the national ambition. So now we have about 350 initiatives in total and projects in total. Of course, we are not going to develop the 350 right now, but we are going to do a prioritization process, defining some specific criteria in order to select the projects that are going to help us to contribute to the ambition and are going to help us also to develop the multidimensional perspective, that including some variables that we want to include, as I'm going to explain to you right now. So, I don't know, maybe it's not, could you, yes, that one, sorry, thank you. So there we go, we can see the 5 components of the national portfolio. So you can see the main topics that are that we are now developing for the 350 initiatives and projects we have. And for this portfolio, we have developed also a strategy to include in all the projects the cross-cutting approaches as peace, human rights, intergenerational, especially with children and youth, and the ethnic and territorial approach. So in that way, we are developing a specific methodology for each one of the cross-cutting approaches and trying to develop technical suggestions for the project formulation teams in order to implement the technical suggestions, and in that way guarantee that we're going to develop the just transition lines that we have. Thank you. And in that way, we will get, from that perspective, from the implementation of the projects and from the participation strategy, all the reviews that we need to formulate the cross-cutting goals and measures for the new NDC. So we want really to see just transition in the next round of NDCs I think that the most important is to guarantee that we can't formulate new targets and measures with that specific emphasis. So then we can't stop talking only from the theory and suggestions and coming to the action and to the practical solutions that we need. Thank you. That's the case of Colombia.
Thank you so much, Christine, and very interesting, I think, and I could say innovative approach that you're taking there, definitely. I think that participatory approach is very important. And thank you also for updating us on what's happening in the negotiations. So we have about 15 minutes left, which is the chance to ask questions or to make comments. Please just say your name and your organization when you make a question. So who would like to? So the lady here, then here, and then we go to the back. Sorry. All right.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Renuka Thakur from UK and founder and CEO of Global Sustainable Futures Network. I have a network around the world and I see plenty of projects like this going on. And I think very good examples from South Africa and Colombia and so on. My question is that how you deal with skill development and woman development integration within while this just transition is happening. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one question, one comment. So you mentioned 100 gigabyte in Europe and 4 gigabyte in Africa, but I think the data would make sense if you tell the need of the countries, like how much energy they need, so I can't really compare. And also two of you mentioned the cooking facilities example. So basically, by the way, I'm a legal scholar and I study technology transfer. I'm really aware of the issue, the situation globally. I studied GEF projects and I realized that in terms of cooking, sometimes, local communities basically reject the technology. Sometimes you bring them cooking facilities that's not harming their lungs because, the coal operated cooking facilities harms their lung, lots of studies about it. But the cultural element is very, very crucial for technology transfer. And I feel like that's not only one example, the same with Indonesian example for nuclear energy, basically the religious leader said, no, we shouldn't accept it. And it wasn't accepted by the community. These kind of examples go on. So I just wanted to make this comment about that. Sometimes science communication is a bit like talking from kind of broadly. And then, for example, in the negotiations, we see European delegates saying that that's the science, we don't compromise, everybody has to follow it. But then the developing countries are saying that, yeah, but you've promised for finance for it or technology for it. So I think science communication is a bit interesting. And I know I talk a lot. Just one last remark, maybe I shouldn't make it, but I want to. So I'm from Turkey and I have been struggling with right-wing government for 20 years. And I know what it means for climate change because often right-wing governments decide to fund less and they adopt trade restrictive policies, which prevents the transfer of technologies. I understand it, completely agree. On the other hand, the way you communicate it felt a bit like to me that you criticize people, like obviously, it sounded like obviously that's wrong and they shouldn't make it. It sounded a bit like, again, wrong science communication to me. I felt like I don't know, I felt like you know everything and then people shouldn't behave like it. And because I'm from Turkey, I know that this language created so much polarization. People started hating each other, even though on a personal level, I would do the same comments with you. But I have been witnessing the same language throughout the 2 weeks, and I find it a bit interesting. And at this point, I just wanted to inform you guys that maybe people may have actually right-wing ideas and they may find it offensive. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that comment and raising that concern. Thank you for being honest as well. And then the last gentleman in the green top there, you still have a question? I think the one. Well, the mic is getting there. Maybe we can start. Yeah, maybe we go there.
Good morning. My name is Ruth Spencer. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda. And I'm really impressed with Colombia because I follow a lot of meetings by Diversity Escazú Agreement, and your colleagues seem to have that local ownership and buy-in for inclusion and participation. And when a government lays it out that they're going to involve all of the people, they're making efforts to reach the people, it impacts me because I live in a country, a small country, and my governments don't know the local groups, even though we're doing so much adaptation, local solutions. And when I hear the government of Colombia, wants to include the people, I just wish all governments were like that, bringing us to the table, including our knowledge, including our solutions, because that's the only way forward, bringing us together, respecting our rights. So big up to Colombia. I'm really proud of your government's efforts to include everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this feedback. Okay, so well, we have 9 minutes left, so let's do one quick question and then we go to the panel for responses. Please say who you are.
Thank you. I hope I'm quick. My name is Britta Lambert. I'm from GIZ. And being German and living in Germany, I find this discussion very, very interesting, especially the focus that you now have on procedural aspects and on participation, because we know from the German experience of the whole process of phasing out of fossil fuels how important that is. I myself work more on the topic of skills development, so I, also wanted to stress the question how, for example, South Africa, Spain, and Colombia include skills development and timely skills development in their NDCs and strategies, because we know that, you have to do that very, very timely and early. And I was also wondering, we were talking about financing, what kind of mechanisms, concrete mechanisms you have in place in your countries. You don't all need to answer, but I would be very interested, especially in areas outside of infrastructure and technology investments, but for example, skills development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's go back to the panel. I think skills development came up twice, so let's start with that one. Who would like to share what your respective countries are doing on skills development? Christina, anything from Colombia on that?
Thank you so much for the questions. So first regarding gender issue, and then following skills development. So gender is included through this methodology in the participation strategy. We are working very hard with the gender team in order to integrate the gender action plan into the purposes that we have and targets and measures that we will develop for the new NDC of Colombia. And they are going to come with us as facilitators on all the round tables at the local level in order to get the specific inputs that could be related to gender in a cross-cutting perspective. And about the skills development, the Ministry of Environment has a direction that is in charge of education and participation, and they are working with all the other directions, in this case with the climate change direction, in order to share all the material and workshops and training sessions and courses that the government can offer in cooperation with the educational ministry of the country. So we have some online courses for many issues of climate change in order to give the possibility to those who can't have the access to come in person, but also regarding those that don't have access to technological tools, we are also developing many tables at local level regarding nowadays the COP16 of the biodiversity that we have in October. Is going to take place in Colombia. So we have a strategy every Friday. We come to the municipalities and we invite stakeholders from the rural areas that don't have the chance to come to Bogota, to the capital city, or even to the capital of their departments and cities and municipalities. So then the ministry is coming with the team in order to get many suggestions for climate action, biodiversity, and peace with nature.
Thank you so much, Christina. Lara?
Thank you. Great question. So to your point on, how do we fund and the specific reskilling and upskilling of co-workers, and especially in Spain, from the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, we have a component 10 that allocated 300 million euros to just transition, 20 million of which are going to reskilling of coal workers and people who work in coal power plants. And the issue, I think the highlight in Spain is that 4,800 workers were supposed to be retrained, but then in the addenda to the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, because there's so much supply so there's so many training courses on offer by the private sector, then in the addenda, the Spanish government reduced that number of reskilling of workers to 800. So I think the interaction between the public and private sector in order to co-design just transition strategies is absolutely key. And Spain has a very strong process in place through the Just Transition Institute, which is a governance innovation, and also through the Just Transition agreements. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. Tiffany?
Yeah, just really quickly on the skills development and women integration, I just wanted to mention two policies which we looked at. One, just to bring in the conversation, apart from energy workers, there's also going to be workers out of work as a result of environmental degradation and nature loss. So land use is another big sector, which I think we've covered maybe slightly less today, but there are policies around that sector as well. And then on gender, we did see in Zambia, for example, in their climate change gender action plan, they talk about, they reference at least credit facilities to help specifically female-headed households in order to access the solar power infrastructure and build that out in their households specifically, as opposed to male households as well.
Thank you. Did you want to come on that, Britta, to the next? No, well, we can move on, and then I'll come back to you before closing. So just quickly on the question of communication and right-wing versus, I think what we were referring to are the recent results of the European elections, where what we have seen is that the vote, which was previously with the Green parties and parties advocating for ambitious climate policies, has now shifted to the right, where the agenda was clearly in the elections very much on the other end of the spectrum. So I think what we are referring here is not questioning particular ideology, but specifically the stance of different parties on climate policy. And what we are seeing that people are across Europe, but also as Britta was talking in South Africa, there has been a shift. They are potentially shifting their support from ambitious climate transition to the other end of the spectrum, which we think is quite a worrying trend, regardless of where you are on the ideology for the rest of the agenda. So just want to clarify that. And now I'd like to go to Simon to talk about your question about energy needs.
Yes, I also can go very quickly. Also, my colleagues in the room from Arena work on that very, very in detail. So in a sense, today we are not meeting the needs of developing countries in terms of scale up of renewables. Similarly to what the nationally determined contributions, Arena work with countries to equip them with tools to understand the supply and demands of the equation. So we work with them on essentially assessing the capacity expansion and how they can integrate more renewables into their grid and off-grid systems. One of interesting work we've done, they could come on the stage if there was time, but this is the work with African countries, all African countries, where we look at the continental master plan for Africa toward 2040. This is an African Union project led, and roughly, to give you a nutshell here, for gigawatt, we're talking about $1 billion investment. We need $1 trillion to, let's say, transition to renewable technology. So there is a huge gap to be filled. And also with this capacity expansion and more fine analysis on how to integrate a variable. This is how as well you can convince banks, institutions to invest in those nationally determined plans. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're sadly out of time. Did you want to? Not if you want to, but otherwise we are out of time. So.
Yeah, maybe just 1 second about skills and gender equality in the South African just energy transition. So skills development is a big challenge. It's hugely contested as well. To what extent, when one localizes and prescribes, and there a lot of initiatives. There's the presidential stimulus program that works towards this, and there's also quite firm procurement rules. So those are, that it's determined to what extent you need to procure or can procure from Black-owned and women-owned businesses. And that, again, is like a two-sided coin. So it may work out where you can actually promote businesses, but it can also be restrictive to the transitions where those businesses just simply don't exist.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. I think it was very clear that just transition is absolutely central to ambitious climate strategies, but also for public support and for ensuring no one is left behind. We have heard excellent examples of pockets of innovation from different countries today on how this can be done. But we also have heard that there is still a great challenge ahead. So let's work together to address that challenge. And thank you for coming today. And thank you to the panelists.